Every account of Sarah Ferguson's life begins with Ronald, the father, the polo manager, the charming, unreliable man whose social connections gave Sarah her proximity to the royal world, and whose personal failings gave her the specific combination of insecurity and performance that defined her public personality for 30 years. Ronald gets examined, Ronald gets the chapter, Ronald takes his place in the standard biographical account as the primary parental influence, the figure whose qualities Sarah absorbed and whose failures she replicated in her own way. Susan Barrantes is the missing figure. She appears in the standard accounts in the compressed form that absent parents receive when the story is organized around the parent who stayed. She left Ronald in 1974, went to Argentina with a polo player named Hector Barrantes, and left behind two daughters aged 16 and 13. The standard account treats this as a biographical fact about Sarah, a wound that explains the adult. Susan herself gets a paragraph, maybe two. She is a catalyst rather than a subject. She was a subject. The palace loathed her, not with the mild institutional disapproval that difficult family members routinely generated in the relevant world, but with something more specific and more visceral. People who managed the institutional dimensions of Sarah's royal life, and who encountered Susan in the course of that management, used language about her in private that went well beyond the standard palace register for problematic relatives. She was regarded as a specific category of problem, charming enough to be socially functional, ruthless enough to deploy the charm for purposes the institution found incompatible with its requirements, and sufficiently indifferent to institutional signals to keep deploying it, regardless of the response. She gave interviews. She made statements about Sarah's private life, her marriage, her financial troubles, her relationships, with a candor that the tabloid press valued precisely because it came directly from the source. The palace found this maddening. The press found it commercially useful. Sarah found it painful in the specific way that daughters find it painful, when the person they most needed to be able to trust is consistently organized around their own interests, rather than anyone else's. Susan Barrantes was not simply a woman who left a difficult marriage and built a better life somewhere else. She was a woman of specific and formidable qualities, whose conduct across 5 decades, through the Ferguson marriage, through the Argentine years, through the spectacular re-entry into Sarah's world, when the royal engagement made proximity to Sarah suddenly valuable again, through the palace years when her behavior alarmed people who were professionally hard to alarm, was the conduct of someone whose intelligence and whose ruthlessness operated in consistent and recognizable ways. The court found her vicious. They were not entirely wrong. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Susan Mary Wright was born in 1937 into the specific tier of English society that sits between the genuinely aristocratic and the professional upper middle class, comfortable enough to move in circles where money was assumed rather than discussed, connected enough to the relevant institutions without being embedded in the landed gentry that sat above that tier in the hierarchy the English class system maintained, through its characteristic combination of explicit denial and implicit enforcement. She was exceptionally attractive. The photographs from her 20s and 30s document this without ambiguity: the bone structure, the physical carriage, the particular quality of presence that makes a person visible in a room before they have done anything to earn the visibility. She understood the attractiveness early. People who know what they have from childhood develop a specific kind of social intelligence around it. Not in the calculating way that cynical accounts of beautiful women tend to assume, but in the more organic way of someone who has learned through repeated experience that the world responds to them favorably, and that this favorable response is a resource that can be managed. She managed it very well. The people who knew Susan Wright in her 20s describe someone whose social capability went considerably beyond good looks. She read rooms accurately. She understood what different people in different situations wanted from an interaction, and she was capable of providing it with a naturalness that made the provision look like warmth rather than strategy. The warmth was partly real. The strategy was always present. The two things were so thoroughly integrated in her social performance that separating them was, for most of the people she dealt with, essentially impossible. This is the woman Ronald Ferguson married in 1956. Ronald was 30 at the marriage, Susan 19. He was a lifeguards officer, which placed him inside the specific social world that the cavalry regiments organized around themselves in post-war Britain. the regimental dinners, the polo, the country house weekends, the particular masculine social culture of men formed in comparable institutions, who had emerged from the war with their class identities intact and their sense of social entitlement undamaged. He was charming in the way that formation reliably produces, easy in company, physically confident, possessed of the specific humor that men who have grown up in all-male institutions develop, and that women in the relevant social world were expected to find endearing. He was also, though this became fully visible only across years rather than months, a man whose judgment about money was consistently worse than his judgment about horses, and whose capacity for genuine intimacy with the people closest to him was limited by the emotional shallowness that the relevant formation produced in a significant proportion of the men it shaped. Susan saw the charm before she saw the limitations. This is not a criticism. Most people see charm before they see limitations, and the relevant social world she was operating in 1956 did not provide extensive opportunities to test the depth behind a man's social performance before the marriage made the depth, or its absence, the daily reality. She assessed Ronald against the available evidence and found him sufficiently favorable to marry. The assessment was not naive, it was simply based on information that the subsequent years would substantially revise. What the marriage offered her at the outset was genuine. The social world Ronald inhabited was a world she wanted to inhabit. The polo circuit, the Hampshire life, the specific positioning in the aristocratic and upper-middle-class circuit that the combination of regiment and sport and connection produced. Dummerdown Farm, the house in Hampshire where the family settled, was the physical expression of the life the marriage made possible. A substantial country property in the right county, within the right social orbit, organized around the right activities. Ronald's appointment as polo manager to the Prince of Wales gave the household an additional dimension of social significance that the relevant world found impressive, and that Susan, who understood social significance and its practical applications very well, recognized as valuable. She was good at the life. This needs saying clearly because the subsequent departure has a tendency to retroactively color the preceding years in ways that obscure what was actually happening during them. Susan Ferguson was a capable and socially effective wife and mother through the years of the marriage's functioning period. She ran the household competently. She was present in the social world that the marriage required her to inhabit. She was good company at the relevant occasions and good management at the relevant domestic requirements. The daughters she produced, Jane born in 1957 and Sarah in 1959, were raised in a household that functioned, that had warmth in it, that was not the site of daily visible misery. The misery was quieter than that, and more specific. Ronald's gambling was not occasional. It was the kind of gambling that produces financial pressure as a background condition of daily life, rather than as a series of discrete crises, the steady drain that requires constant management to prevent from becoming visible in contexts where visibility would be damaging. The polo world normalized a certain level of gambling among its male participants, which provided Ronald with both the opportunity and the social cover. But the normalization of the behavior in the social world did not normalize its financial consequences in the household, and Susan was the person managing the gap between what the household's surface required and what Ronald's gambling reliably left available to fund it. The infidelity was similarly consistent rather than dramatic. The polo circuit in the 1960s and into the 1970s was a social world in which affairs were common enough to have their own ambient code of management. The collective discretion that the relevant world applied to the private conduct of its members when that conduct fell within the range of behavior the world considered unremarkable. Ronald's conduct fell within that range. The people who knew the Ferguson marriage in its Hampshire setting had, by the mid-1960s, an accurate enough picture of Ronald's behavior to understand that the marriage's surface and the marriage's private reality had a gap that Susan was managing with the specific competence of someone who understood what the management required and was providing it. What Susan did not do, and what the relevant social world's code required her to do, was acknowledge the gap in any form that the relevant world would have been required to respond to. The code was the code of collective non-acknowledgement. Affairs were managed through discretion rather than confronted through honesty. Financial difficulties were managed through the maintenance of the required surface rather than addressed through the reduction of the lifestyle that the surface required. The code served the relevant world's interest in maintaining its own presentation, and the price of the code's functioning was paid by the people inside the marriages the code was managing. Susan paid the price for longer than her character was equipped to pay it. Her character was not equipped for indefinite payment. The specific combination of intelligence and decisiveness that had always been her primary qualities was not a combination that sustained indefinitely the management of situations whose honest assessment had produced a clear conclusion about what the management was costing and what it was worth. She had always been at the level of private assessment rather than social performance, honest about what she was looking at. The social performance could maintain its required surface. The private assessment was not available for indefinite suspension in the service of the performance. By the early 1970s, the private assessment of the Ferguson marriage had reached conclusions that the performance was finding increasingly difficult to cover. The gambling was worse or no better, which amounts to the same thing across enough years. The infidelity was no more discreet, and discretion in the relevant world required the cooperation of the person whose conduct required discretion. And Ronald's cooperation was unreliable in the specific way that the cooperation of people whose appetites consistently outpace their judgment is unreliable. The financial pressure was real and ongoing. The emotional availability that the marriage had never provided in sufficient quantity was not improving with the passage of time, and was not going to improve, because the formation that had produced Ronald's emotional shallowness was not a formation that the years of marriage were revising. Susan had met Hector Barrantes through the polo world. The meeting was not accidental in the sense of being produced by circumstances that neither party had organized. The polo circuit was the circuit both inhabited, and the specific combination of her qualities and his had sufficient time and sufficient shared environment to produce the connection that it produced. Hector was an Argentine polo player of genuine professional standing, among the top players of his era, serious about the sport in the way that the sport at the highest level requires its participants to be serious, possessed of a physical capability and a professional achievement that the polo world organized its social hierarchy around. He was also, by the accounts of people who knew him in the relevant period, reliable in the specific sense that the Ferguson marriage had made most relevant to Susan's assessment of what she wanted next. Reliable in the deeper sense, a person whose conduct was organized around consistent principles rather than around shifting appetites. He was present with people in a way that Ronald was not present, actually attentive, actually engaged with the person in front of him, rather than with the social performance the relevant occasion required. He took things seriously that he decided to take seriously, and he followed through on the decisions he made. Susan assessed Hector with the accuracy she brought to all her assessments. The assessment was favorable in the specific ways that the assessment of the Ferguson marriage had become unfavorable. The conclusion produced the decision produced the departure. What needs to be said about the departure, before the departure itself is addressed, is what the departure was and what it was not. It was the decision of a woman who had honestly assessed an inadequate marriage and found an alternative she considered superior, and who had acted on the assessment with the decisiveness that was her most consistent character trait. It was not the impulsive response to a romantic infatuation. Susan was 37 years old when she left. The decision had been building across years of private assessment. Hector was the occasion for the departure's execution rather than the cause of the departure itself, which was the cause of the marriage's specific and documented failures across 2 decades. This distinction matters because the standard account of the Ferguson marriage's end tends to organize itself around the affair as the moral fact and around Susan as the moral failure. The organization serves a narrative that has Ronald as the wronged party and Susan as the woman who abandoned her family for a lover, which is the narrative that the relevant social world found most useful because it placed the conduct requiring explanation on the departing woman rather than on the marriage's accumulated failures that the departing woman was departing from. The honest account places the accumulated failures at the center where they belong. The gambling, the infidelity, the financial unreliability, the emotional shallowness. These were the marriage's actual history across almost 2 decades, and they were the history that Susan's decision to leave was a response to. Hector Barrantes did not destroy the Ferguson marriage. The Ferguson marriage had been destroying itself for years, and Susan was the person who decided to stop managing the destruction and start managing her own exit. The exit was clean in the specific sense that Susan executed it with the competence she brought to everything she decided to do. She left. She went to Argentina. She married Hector. She built a new life on the Barrantes estancia in the province of Buenos Aires, and she built it completely, with the intelligence and the social capability that had always been her most reliable assets. She left Jane and Sarah behind. Jane was 16, Sarah was 13. The leaving of 2 daughters by their mother, at those specific ages, in the specific circumstances of a departure to another continent is not something that the honest account can manage into the background of the story about Susan's character without losing the most important evidence about what that character actually was. The departure from the daughters was not a byproduct of the departure from Ronald. It was a separate decision, made by the same person applying the same decisiveness to the same honest assessment of what she was leaving and what she was going toward. What she was leaving included her daughters. The assessment that produced the departure had assessed the daughters as part of what was being left, and the departure proceeded. Jane and Sarah remained at Dummerdown Farm with Ronald, and Susan went to Argentina, and the relationship between mother and daughters became the relationship that distance and departure produce, when the distance is chosen by the person who created it. Sarah was 13. 13 is the age at which a daughter needs her mother in the specific developmental sense that the adolescent years require, the female formation that the primary maternal relationship is supposed to provide across the years when identity is consolidating and the models for adult female selfhood are being absorbed from the primary female figure in the formation environment. Susan's departure removed the primary female figure from Sarah's formation environment at precisely the moment the developmental literature is most consistent about that figure being required. The removal shaped everything that followed, not simply in the obvious way of creating an absence that Sarah spent her adult life trying to fill, though that absence was real and its consequences were documented across the full span of Sarah's public life, in the specific patterns that maternal abandonment at 13 reliably produces in the adults it shapes. More specifically, in the way that the particular qualities of the person who departed shaped the formation of the daughter she left behind. Susan was the primary female model available to Sarah across the years of her childhood, and the model Susan provided, in the years before the departure as well as in the quality of the departure itself, was a model of a specific kind of female intelligence and a specific kind of female ruthlessness operating together in a single person. Sarah absorbed both. She absorbed the intelligence imperfectly, because the formation that should have continued across the adolescent years was cut off at 13, and because Ronald's subsequent parenting, well-intentioned in its way and genuinely warm in many of its expressions, was not the formation that a mother's continued presence would have provided. She absorbed the ruthlessness incompletely, because Susan's ruthlessness was organized and disciplined, and in service of Susan's clearly understood priorities, while Sarah's version of the same quality was disorganized and inconsistent, and in service of needs she understood poorly because the formation that would have helped her understand them had been interrupted. The mother made the daughter in the specific way that the first 13 years of intensive female formation and the subsequent decades of periodic contact across a chosen distance make a daughter. The making was real, and it was consequential, and it was not kind, and the woman at the center of the making was the woman the palace would later find vicious, the court would find alarming, and Sarah would find, across the full span of her adult public life, the most complicated and the most painful relationship she had to manage. Susan Wright became Susan Barrantes and went to Argentina and built a new life, and the life she built was in many respects exactly what she had decided it would be. She was competent at it. She was happy in it, in the specific sense that people who act on their honest assessments and find their assessments were correct are happy in the consequences of those assessments. The daughters were 3,000 miles away and growing up without her. The consequences of that were going to take years to fully arrive. And when they arrived in the specific form of Susan Barrantes re-entering a world she had left behind, and finding it transformed by her younger daughter's royal marriage into something considerably more valuable than she had left behind, and managing that re-entry with the same intelligence and the same decisive competence she had always brought to the management of available opportunities. The palace was not ready for her. The palace had never dealt with anyone quite like Susan Barrantes, and the dealing, when it came, produced the specific institutional response that the title of this account reflects, and that the subsequent parts of this account document in the specific detail it deserves. Dummerdown Farm sits in Hampshire, in the specific stretch of English countryside that looks from the road exactly like what English countryside is supposed to look like. The rolling fields, the old stone, the particular quality of organized rural prosperity that the relevant social world maintained as its primary physical expression. The Ferguson household in the 1960s was part of that world, in the specific way that a cavalry officer's family with the right connections and the right social instincts could be part of it. present at the right occasions, known to the right people, occupying the right position in the local hierarchy without being at its apex. Ronald managed the surface of this world with the ease of someone born to managing surfaces. The charm worked at every level it was required to work, with the polo crowd, with the Hampshire neighbors, with the people whose good opinion the relevant social world required its participants to maintain. He was good company consistently enough that the people who found him unreliable in private continued to find him good company in public, which is a more useful social combination than it might initially appear, and which served Ronald well across decades of conduct that should, by strict accounting, have cost him more socially than it did. Susan managed the reality behind the surface. This was the marriage's actual division of labor, and it was a division that placed the more demanding work with the person who was simultaneously receiving the less favorable end of the arrangement's private dimensions. The gambling was the first of those private dimensions to establish itself as a permanent feature rather than an occasional problem. Ronald bet on horses, not recreationally, not in the limited way that the polo world's culture normalized among its participants, as simply the expected accompaniment to a life organized around horses and competition. He bet with the specific compulsive consistency that produces financial pressure as a background condition, rather than a periodic disruption, the slow drain that is harder to address than a dramatic crisis because it never produces a single moment of sufficient severity to force the confrontation that might change the behavior. Susan managed the drain. She managed it the way that wives in the relevant social world managed such things in the 1960s, which is to say without acknowledging it in any form that would require the relevant world to respond to the acknowledgement. The household's accounts were hers to manage, and she managed them against the consistent shortfall that Ronald's gambling produced, with the specific competence of someone who understood that the management was her responsibility, and that performing it was the price of maintaining the surface that the relevant world required. The surface required maintaining because the surface was the social currency. The Ferguson's position in the Hampshire world, in the polo world, in the social orbit that Ronald's Lifeguards Commission and his connection to the Prince of Wales's polo operation had established for them, was a position whose value was inseparable from its visible maintenance. A household that allowed its financial difficulties to become visible in the relevant social world was a household that was losing the social currency that its position depended on. Susan understood this with complete clarity, and she managed accordingly. What she could not manage, and what the relevant world's code did not provide effective tools for managing, was Ronald's relationship with other women. The code of the polo world in the 1960s was a code that accommodated a certain level of male infidelity through the mechanism of collective non-acknowledgement. Men had affairs. The relevant world knew they had affairs. The relevant world did not discuss what it knew, because discussing it would require the relevant world to respond to what it knew, and the relevant world preferred not to respond because response was disruptive, and disruption was socially expensive. The code served men like Ronald extremely well. It served their wives considerably less well, because the code's functioning required the wives to absorb the knowledge of what their husbands were doing, without the specific responses that the knowledge would naturally produce in anyone not bound by the code's requirements. Susan absorbed the knowledge. She absorbed it across years. She absorbed it with the specific combination of clear-eyed assessment and managed external composure that her social formation and her own character both required of her, and the absorption was real, genuine rather than performed, because Susan's social intelligence was the intelligence of someone who understood what was in front of her, rather than the intelligence of someone who had learned to perform not seeing what was there. The specific women Ronald was involved with across the years of the marriage are not all documented in the public record with the precision that named sources would require for confident specific attribution. What is documented through the accounts of people who moved through the polo world during the relevant period and who have described the marriage's private dimensions in the fragmentary ways that private testimony eventually reaches the record, is the pattern, persistent, consistent, insufficiently discreet to be invisible to the people in the relevant world who were paying attention. Susan was paying attention. The thing about paying close attention to something that is causing you damage is that it produces a very specific kind of exhaustion, not the dramatic exhaustion of acute crisis, but the grinding exhaustion of sustained vigilance in service of a management task that has no resolution available within the current arrangement. You cannot stop paying attention because the consequences of inattention are worse than the exhaustion of vigilance. You cannot stop managing because the alternative to management is the collapse of the surface that the arrangement requires. The management continues and the exhaustion accumulates, and the honest private assessment of whether the arrangement is worth what it is costing becomes progressively harder to manage toward the conclusion that the code requires. By the late 1960s, Susan's private assessment had reached conclusions that were difficult to sustain within the code's requirements. By the early 1970s, those conclusions were producing in her the specific internal pressure of someone who has understood what the honest assessment requires and is managing the delay of acting on that assessment in service of the children's stability and the relevant world's requirements and the specific practical difficulties of departure. The children's stability is the element of the delay that the standard account tends to treat most generously, presenting Susan's years of staying through the marriage's deterioration as evidence of maternal commitment, and then treating the eventual departure as the abandonment of that commitment. The honest account treats the delay and the departure as expressions of the same honest assessment operating across time, the assessment that the marriage was insufficient finally producing, when the assessment had become impossible to sustain indefinitely against the delay, the decision that the delay had been preventing. Sarah and Jane were young enough through most of the 1960s that the departure was not yet the honest assessment's obvious conclusion. The children required their mother. Susan provided what her children required. The provision was genuine. She was present in their formation across the childhood years, in the specific way that a competent and socially capable mother is present, providing warmth and structure and the female formation. Of course, in any explicit or conscious sense, she had concluded that the marriage was insufficient, and the daughters were part of the marriage's domestic reality, and the departure from the marriage was therefore also a departure from the daughters, and the departure from the daughters was managed through letters and visits, and the maintained warmth of intermittent contact. But a 13-year-old does not process her mother's departure as the reasonable response to an inadequate marriage. She processes it as abandonment. The processing is wrong in its causal attribution and correct in its emotional reality, and the emotional reality is the reality that the adult formation absorbs, rather than the causal attribution that the adult understanding might subsequently revise. Sarah's formation absorbed the abandonment. The revision came later, partially in the adult accounts of her relationship with Susan, that express both love for the mother and clear-eyed understanding of what the mother had done. The revision was never complete, because formations completed in the first 13 years are not fully revisable by the understandings the adult years produce. The emotional reality of the abandonment remained in place beneath the revised understanding, expressing itself in the specific behavioral patterns that the subsequent decades documented with a consistency that made the connection between the departure and its consequences impossible to honestly deny. The departure was what it was. Argentina was where it went. The daughters were what it left behind. The consequences were what they were, and what they were was going to take decades to fully express itself, and the fullest expression of those consequences would come not in Hampshire but in Buckingham Palace, in the specific form of Susan Barrantes re-entering the world her daughter's royal marriage had made available, and conducting herself in it in the ways that made the palace reach for the specific language this account's title reflects. That was coming. In August 1974, it was still 12 years away. Susan was on an estancia in Argentina building the life she had decided to build, and Sarah was in Hampshire at 13, beginning the long process of becoming the adult that the departure had made her. The adult Sarah became was the adult the departure produced. The connection was not destiny, it was formation. Formation is not destiny in the fatalistic sense, but it is the substrate from which adult character grows, and the substrate that the 1974 departure laid down in Sarah's instance had decided to produce, rather than the relationship that geographical accident had imposed on everyone. Jane managed the distance with the specific resilience that her older age at the departure and her closer observation of the marriage's deterioration had produced in her. Jane had understood enough of what the marriage had been to have a context for the departure that gave the departure a meaning beyond abandonment. The meaning did not eliminate the pain, but it gave the pain a framework that made it processable in ways that Sarah's 13-year-old version of the same experience did not provide the same framework for. Sarah had no adequate framework. She had the departure and the distance and the letters and the visits and the warmth that all of those expressed across the 3,000 miles of chosen geography, and she had the specific absence at the center of her formation that the warmth across the distance could not address, because the warmth across the distance was not what the formation required. The formation required presence. Presence was in Argentina. In 1985, Sarah Ferguson started a relationship with Prince Andrew, Duke of York. The relationship developed across the following months, with the speed that genuine mutual attraction produces between two people who are also in different ways looking for something specific in the relationship they are developing. In March 1986, the engagement was announced. In Buenos Aires, Susan Barrantes read the announcement with the specific quality of attention that someone of her social intelligence brings to information about an opportunity. The Argentine years had given her the life she had gone to Argentina to build. They had given her Hector, and the estancia, and the Argentine social world, and the specific satisfaction of operating on her own terms in an environment where her capabilities and the environment's requirements were aligned. They had also left her 3,000 miles from the social world in which her younger daughter had just become the most discussed woman in Britain. The distance was about to close, not because Susan was going to leave Argentina. She was not going to leave Argentina, and the estancia and Hector and the life she had built there remained the center of her existence. But because the announcement of Sarah's engagement to Prince Andrew had transformed the social value of proximity to Sarah in ways that made the maintenance of the distant number of people, to the press, which would find Susan's story compelling for the specific combination of the Argentine life and the glamour of the royal connection, to the social world in which Susan moved, which would find her proximity to the royal family newly significant, and to the palace, which would have to manage the specific challenge that a divorced remarried Argentine resident mother of a new royal bride presented to the institutional management of its public account. Susan began managing the re-entry before the wedding. The management was characteristically efficient. She appeared in London in the period leading up to the July 1986 wedding, and the appearances were managed with the specific social competence that had always been her strongest quality. She was charming in the press encounters that the wedding preparations made inevitable. She was warm in the public dimensions of the family occasions that the engagement period organized around itself. She presented the specific surface that the relevant occasion required, and the surface was well constructed and effectively maintained. The palace observed the surface and assessed what was behind it with the professional wariness that the palace applied to every new entrant into the institutional world that the royal family organized around itself. The assessment was not immediately alarming. Susan was presentable, she was socially capable, she understood the relevant codes well enough to perform the required surface with competence. The initial assessment produced cautious approval rather than the specific alarm that subsequent experience would generate. What the initial assessment could not fully capture was the specific way that Susan's qualities operated when the relevant context did not require her to maintain the managed surface, when the occasion was the private social occasion rather than the public one, when the institutional monitoring was reduced or absent, when the specific code of the relevant world that the palace enforced around its members was not being actively enforced around a woman whose primary relationship to the palace was as the mother-in-law of a working senior royal, rather than as a member of the institution herself. Susan was not a member of the institution. This was the crucial structural fact that the subsequent years would consistently demonstrate in its full public account was most intensive and most effective, but progressively across the months and years that followed the July 1986 wedding, as the specific social position of being the Duchess of York's mother generated the press appetite that the position reliably generated, and as Susan assessed that the press appetite was an asset she was in a position to manage for her own benefit rather than for the institution's. The interviews she gave were interviews organized around the specific information that she was in a position to provide, and that the press was in a position to value: information about Sarah, about the family, about the Ferguson background, about the specific private dimensions of the life that Susan's proximity to Sarah gave her access to, and that the institutional management of the royal marriage's public account required to remain private. Susan's deployment of that information was not always dramatic or direct. She was too socially intelligent for the crude breach of confidence that would have produced immediate institutional response and immediate damage to her own position. The deployment was managed through the specific register of the indiscreet intimate, the interview that seemed warm and personal rather than calculated, the quote that revealed more than it appeared to reveal, the comment that gave the press what it needed, while maintaining the surface of a mother simply proud of her daughter and pleased to share that pride with the wider world. The palace found this maddening. Not immediately, not in the first months of the royal marriage when the management of the new situation was still in its initial phase. Progressively, as the pattern of Susan's press conduct became clear enough for the institutional assessment to produce the specific conclusion that Susan Barrantes was a woman who understood the value of what she had access to and was going to deploy that value in service of her own interests, regardless of what the institutional interest required. The specific incidents that generated the most acute institutional response, visits, and the warmth that both parties brought to the intermittent contact, and who has arrived at the most significant moment of her adult life in the specific form of a royal engagement, has a very particular emotional investment in her mother's presence at that moment. Sarah wanted Susan there. She wanted her at the engagement celebrations and at the wedding preparations, and at the wedding itself, and at the official and unofficial occasions that the royal marriage organized around itself in its early period. She wanted the specific presence that had been unavailable across the 12 years of the Argentine distance, and the royal engagement was the occasion that seemed to make the presence available in a new and sustained way, that seemed to bring Susan back into the center of Sarah's world, in the way that the departure had removed her from it. Susan came. She was present at the wedding. She was present at the occasions that followed the wedding. She was warmly received by Sarah and, initially, by the institutional world that the wedding had placed Sarah inside. The presence was the presence that Sarah had wanted, and in the immediate period of its provision it was the presence that generated genuine warmth between mother and daughter. The specific warmth of a relationship whose intermittent quality had given the contact, when the contact happened, an intensity that more continuous relationships do not typically produce. The warmth was real. What was also real was the specific way that Susan's presence in the royal world was organized. It was not organized primarily around Sarah's emotional needs or around the institutional requirements of the royal marriage that Sarah had entered. It was organized around Susan's own assessment of the opportunities that the presence provided and the specific deployment of those opportunities in service of Susan's own clearly understood priorities. The priorities were social positioning and commercial value, and the specific form of personal significance that proximity to the most discussed royal family in the world provided to someone who had always been very good at understanding the value of social proximity to significant people, and very effective at deploying that proximity for her own purposes. The palace watched the deployment with the progressive alarm of an institution discovering that the woman it was dealing with was not amenable to the management tools it had available for dealing with difficult peripheral figures in the royal world. The peripheral figures who generated the most acute institutional challenges were typically figures whose connection to the institution gave them access to the institutional world without giving the institution authority over their conduct, and Susan was the most acute version of this category that the relevant people in the palace had encountered in the specific period of the royal marriage's early years. She was more intelligent than most of the peripheral figures the palace managed. She was more socially capable than most of them. She was more clearly aware of what she had and how to use it than most of them. And she was, in the specific sense that mattered most for the institutional management of the challenge she presented, entirely without the institutional loyalty that would have required her to manage the access she had in service of the institutional interest, rather than in service of her own. Ronald Ferguson had his own institutional problems across the relevant period, the Wigmore Club revelation of 1988, in which his membership of a London massage parlour became public knowledge, and produced the specific embarrassment that a polo manager to the Prince of Wales whose daughter had married into the royal family generates when his private conduct becomes tabloid material. Ronald's problems were Ronald's problems, and they contributed to the general atmosphere of family chaos that surrounded Sarah's royal marriage across its later years. But Ronald's problems were the problems of a man who was, at some level, subject to the institutional management of the world he had been part of across decades, whose social positioning was connected to the institutional world in ways that gave the institutional world some leverage over his conduct. Susan's problems were the problems of a woman who was not subject to that management, who had no institutional positioning that the institutional world could threaten, and who was therefore free to conduct herself in the ways her own assessment produced, rather than in the ways the institutional interest required. The freedom was the specific quality that made her the specific challenge she was. The palace could not manage Susan Barrantes through the tools available for managing people whose institutional positioning gave those tools purchase. It could manage her only through Sarah. And managing her through Sarah required Sarah to be in a position to manage her mother in the specific ways the palace needed, which required Sarah to be both willing and capable. Sarah was willing, intermittently. She was capable, occasionally. She was also the daughter of the woman she was being asked to manage. which meant the managing was always in competition with the wanting of the mother's presence and approval that the 12 years of Argentine distance had produced in Sarah, and that was not going to be resolved by the institutional management of the challenge that the mother's presence in the royal world was generating. The competition between the wanting and the managing was the specific dynamic that defined the relationship between Susan and Sarah across the years of the royal marriage. The palace watched the dynamic with the alarm of an institution discovering that the specific challenge Susan Barrantes presented was a challenge it was not equipped to resolve through any of the tools available to it. The tools were not available because Susan was not subject to them. She had understood this from the beginning. She had assessed it in Buenos Aires in March 1986, when the engagement announcement had produced in her the specific quality of attention that she always brought to information about available opportunities. She had acted on the assessment with the decisiveness that had always been her most consistent character trait. The palace was not ready. The word loathed is the word this account's title uses and the word that the available record from the relevant period most accurately reflects in the private language of the people whose professional function required them to assess and manage the challenge that Susan Barrantes presented to the institutional management of Sarah's royal life. It is a strong word, and its strength is calibrated to the specific intensity of the institutional response that Susan generated across the years of her proximity to the royal world. A response that went considerably beyond the standard palace register for difficult family members, and that expressed itself in the private contexts where palace officials spoke candidly, in terms that the people who have described those contexts to subsequent biographers and journalists have characterized with a consistency that the word loathed more accurately captures than any softer alternative. The palace had managed difficult family members before Susan Barrantes. The history of the 20th century British royal family contained multiple examples of relatives whose conduct generated institutional concern and required institutional management. The Duke of Windsor's post-abdication conduct, the various difficulties generated by the extended family's commercial activities and personal indiscretions, the specific challenges of managing the social worlds of senior royals, whose marriages were producing the kind of private chaos that the institutional management of the public account required to remain private. The palace had tools for these challenges and experience of applying them, and the tools and the experience had produced, across the relevant decades, a reasonably effective institutional management capability for the category of problem that difficult family members represented. Susan did not fit neatly into the category that the tools were designed to manage. The tools were designed for people with institutional connections, people whose social positioning and professional standing were connected to the royal world in ways that gave the institutional management leverage over their conduct. The threat of reduced access, the social and professional consequences of being seen to have violated the relevant codes, the specific signals that the palace sent through the relevant social world about the appropriate management of particular people and situations. These were tools that worked on people whose position within the relevant social world gave those tools purchase. Susan's position gave the tools very limited purchase. She was not seeking access to the royal world in the sense of needing it for her social or professional positioning. She was already socially positioned through the Argentine life she had built, through Hector's professional standing, through the specific social world of the international polo circuit that had always been her primary social environment. The palace's ability to threaten reduced access to the royal world as a consequence of conduct it found problematic was the ability to threaten something Susan valued but did not require, and the distinction between valuing something and requiring it is the distinction that determines how effective the threat of its withdrawal can be as a management tool. The specific incidents that generated the most acute institutional responses across the relevant years require examination in some detail, because the pattern they form is more revealing than any single incident, and because the pattern is the evidence of a consistent orientation rather than a series of isolated lapses in judgment. The press interviews were the most consistent source of institutional concern. Susan gave them with a frequency and a candor that the palace found alarming, and the candor was of the specific kind that was most difficult to manage. Not the crude breach of confidence that would have been immediately identifiable and immediately actionable, but the warm indiscretion of a mother speaking proudly and openly about her daughter in terms that revealed more than the institutional management of the royal marriage's public account required to be revealed. She spoke about Sarah's marriage to Andrew in terms that the palace preferred to remain unspoken, not in the specific sense of disclosing secrets. Susan was too socially intelligent for the crude disclosure that would have produced immediate and dramatic institutional response. In the more specific sense of discussing the texture of the marriage's private reality in ways that the press could use as the basis for coverage that the palace had not authorized and could not fully control. The comments about Sarah's happiness, or about the marriage's specific domestic texture, or about the relationship between Sarah and Andrew in the specific terms that a mother who was in regular contact with her daughter would have access to, these were the comments that the palace found most difficult to manage because they were comments that were simultaneously too warm and too specific to be easily characterized as hostile or inappropriate, but that consistently gave the press material that the institutional management of the marriage's public account required to remain unavailable. Ronald Allison, who served as the Queen's press secretary across the relevant period, was among the palace officials whose professional function required the most direct engagement with the challenge that Susan's press conduct presented. His private assessments of Susan's behavior, as described by people who worked alongside him during the relevant period, reflected the specific frustration of a professional whose management tools were being consistently outmaneuvered by someone who understood the press world well enough to deploy information in the register that maximized its value while minimizing the institutional grounds for objecting to the deployment. The social occasions presented different but related challenges. Susan's conduct at the palace social occasions she attended, the events that Sarah's royal position organized around itself and that Susan attended as Sarah's mother, was conduct that the people who observed it described in terms that clustered consistently around the same qualities. She was too direct. She was insufficiently deferential to the hierarchical protocols that the palace social world organized around itself. She made comments in social settings that the relevant code required not to be made, with the specific social confidence of someone who understood the relevant code clearly enough to know exactly where its boundaries were, and who chose to position herself consistently just beyond them, rather than within them. The positioning just beyond the boundaries was the most sophisticated element of Susan's conduct in the palace social world, and it is the element that the word vicious most accurately describes in the specific sense the word carries in the relevant context. Vicious in the sense of vice, of the precise knowing transgression rather than the blundering error. Susan knew where the boundaries were. She had the social intelligence to know exactly where they were, and the specific judgment to position herself just beyond them, rather than so far beyond them, that the institutional response would have been both immediate and justified. The positioning produced the specific response of an institution that found itself consistently dealing with conduct that was just beyond the range of what the available management tools were designed to address. Not far enough beyond the range to justify the specific responses that egregious violations warranted. Just far enough beyond to generate the consistent low-level institutional alarm that is more difficult to manage than the acute crisis, because the acute crisis produces its own resolution through the specific mechanisms that crises activate, while the consistent low-level alarm simply accumulates without producing the specific moment of resolution that would end the accumulating. The comments she made at specific palace social occasions when she read the engagement announcement. She had acted on the assessment ever since. The standard biographical accounts of Susan Barrantes treat her marriage to Hector as the romantic conclusion of the departure from England, the love story that justified the leaving, the relationship that proved the assessment correct, the happy ending that the abandoned daughters and the abandoned husband were the price of. The treatment is too simple and too organized around the romantic narrative to be the honest account, because the honest account of the Hector marriage is not primarily a love story, though the love was real. It is primarily the account of what Susan's specific choices in forming and sustaining the marriage reveal about her character, her priorities, and the specific qualities that made her the person the palace found so difficult to manage. Hector Barrantes was born in Argentina in 1934. He was 3 years older than Susan, which placed them in the same post-war generation whose formation had been shaped by comparable historical pressures on opposite sides of the Atlantic. He came from the specific Argentine social world that the polo culture had organized around itself in the province of Buenos Aires across the decades when Argentina was establishing its dominance in the international game, a world of estancias and horses and the specific masculine culture of competitive polo at the highest level, where professional standing was determined by what you could do on a horse, rather than by the social credentials that the English version of the relevant world layered over its assessment of the same capabilities. He was among the best players of his generation. The accounts of his professional standing in the polo world of the 1960s and 1970s consistently place him in the category of players whose capability was genuine enough to command the specific respect that genuine capability commands, in worlds where genuine capability is the primary criterion of standing. He was not a charming amateur whose social credentials supplemented modest professional achievement. He was a serious professional athlete at the peak of a serious professional sport, and the seriousness was the quality that the accounts of people who knew him most consistently identify as his defining characteristic. The seriousness extended from the professional into the personal. Hector was not Ronald. The comparison is inescapable, and it is the comparison that the honest account of the Hector marriage requires. Sarah. The paying had shaped Sarah's adult life in every dimension that the subsequent public record documents. The payer and the cost are what this account has been assembled to examine honestly, in the specific terms that the examination requires, and that the standard accounts of Sarah Ferguson's life have consistently declined to provide. The connection between Susan Barrantes' specific conduct across her adult life and the specific qualities that defined Sarah Ferguson's adult public existence is not the connection of simple causation. The bad mother who produced the damaged daughter, the departure that explained everything that followed. Simple causation is too clean for what the honest examination of the available evidence produces, and too clean accounts of complicated human formations tend to obscure more than they reveal about the specific mechanisms through which one person's choices shape another person's development. The honest account is more specific and more uncomfortable than simple causation. It is the account of a woman of considerable intelligence and decisive capability who made choices organized around her own clearly understood priorities, and whose choices produced in the daughter she was closest to at the most critical developmental moment a specific pattern of formation whose consequences the subsequent decades of Sarah's public life documented with a consistency that makes the connection between the formation and its source impossible to honestly deny. Susan did not intend to damage Sarah. The distinction between intended and unintended consequences matters for the moral assessment of conduct, though it matters less than the standard sympathetic accounts of Susan tend to assume, because the unintended consequences of deliberate choices remain the consequences of those choices, regardless of whether the person making them anticipated or intended the consequences they produced. Susan chose to leave in 1974. She chose to leave for Argentina rather than for somewhere closer. She chose to build her new life with the completeness that the estancia and the marriage to Hector represented. She chose to maintain the relationship with her daughters through the specific mechanisms of distance, letters, and periodic visits, rather than through any arrangement that would have placed her in more sustained daily contact with them across the years of their adolescent formation. Each of these choices was made by someone who had assessed the situation with the intelligence she always brought to her assessments, and who had acted on the assessment with the decisiveness that had always been her most consistent character trait. The consequences for Sarah were the consequences those choices produced in the specific person who bore them at the specific developmental moment at which she bore them. The consequences were not random or unpredictable in the sense of having no discernible relationship to the choices that produced them. They were the specific consequences that the departure of the primary maternal figure at 13, followed by 24 years of maintained contact across a chosen distance, reliably produces in the daughters who experience them. The hunger for approval is the first and most consistently documented of those consequences. Sarah's adult life was organized, in its most significant dimensions, around the specific hunger of someone whose primary experience of the attachment relationship had been the experience of the most important attachment being removed, and of the removal being managed, across the subsequent years through the warmth of intermittent contact, rather than through the restoration of the sustained presence that the removal had taken away. The hunger expressed itself most clearly in Sarah's relationships with powerful figures whose approval she needed in the specific way that the formation had produced needing, with Andrew, whose royal status made his approval the most institutionally significant approval available in the relevant world, and whose emotion continuing to manage, with the Queen, whose approval of Sarah's performance as a royal wife was the institutional version of the maternal approval that had been unavailable since 1974. With the various powerful men and women whose proximity to the institutional world gave their approval the specific weight that the formation had trained Sarah to seek from the figures whose significance in the relevant world was the significance she had internalized as the measure of approval worth having. The seeking was consistent. The sufficiency of what the seeking produced was consistently insufficient, because the hunger it was directed at addressing was a hunger that no amount of institutional approval or powerful figure validation was capable of addressing. The hunger was for the specific thing that Susan's departure had removed: the daily presence of the primary maternal figure. The sustained relationship with the person whose continuing presence in the formation environment was supposed to be providing the specific developmental work that the adolescent years require. No approval from Andrew or the Queen or anyone in the institutional world was going to provide the specific thing that the daily presence of a mother provides to a 13-year-old daughter. The seeking was therefore seeking directed at the wrong targets for the right underlying need, and the consistent insufficiency of what the seeking produced was the consistent insufficiency of targets that cannot provide what they are being sought for, regardless of how generously they provide what they can actually offer. The financial recklessness is the second major consequence that the available record documents, with the consistency that makes its connection to the formation's specific character unmistakable. Sarah's financial conduct across the years of the royal marriage and the subsequent decades, the spending, the debts, the specific pattern of financial decisions that the institutional management of her situation found consistently alarming, and that the public accounts of her post-royal commercial life documented in considerable detail, was not the conduct of someone who was simply careless about money in the generic sense. It was the conduct of someone who had never developed the specific internal security that allows financial decisions to be made from a position of genuine confidence, rather than from the position of someone managing the anxiety of insufficiency. The anxiety of insufficiency was not financial anxiety in the narrow sense of anxiety about whether there was enough money. It was the broader anxiety of someone whose foundational experience had been the experience of the most important resource in her early life being removed, and of having to manage the removal through the performance of adequacy rather than through the possession of the real thing. People who manage the performance of adequacy rather than possessing the real thing tend to spend in the specific ways that the performance requires, to maintain the surface that the performance demands, regardless of whether the surface's maintenance is sustainable within the actual resources available, because the surface's maintenance is the primary available substitute for the security that its maintenance is supposed to represent. Susan had managed a comparable dynamic across the years of the Ferguson marriage, the maintenance of the required surface against the financial reality that Ronald's gambling produced. Sarah absorbed the dynamic at the level of formation and replicated it in her own life in the specific form her own circumstances produced. The replication was not conscious. The formation's most significant legacies are never conscious in the sense of being deliberately chosen or deliberately maintained. They operate beneath the level of conscious awareness, in the texture of the choices and the patterns and the specific behavioral orientations that the adult life accumulates, without the adult fully understanding why the accumulation takes the specific form it takes. The pattern of attaching to powerful men and finding them insufficient is the third major consequence the record documents. Andrew was the most significant and most public version of the pattern, but the pattern preceded Andrew in the specific sequence of Sarah's adult relationships and followed the divorce in the subsequent relationships that her post-royal social world produced. The pattern was the pattern of someone whose most fundamental experience of the attachment relationship had taught her that the people she attached to most completely would eventually be found insufficient for what she needed from them. Insufficient in the same specific way that Ronald had been insufficient for Susan. Insufficient in the same way that the distance Susan maintained had been insufficient for what Sarah needed from the maternal relationship. The insufficiency was built into the attachment from its beginning, because the formation had produced in Sarah the specific quality of need that made the insufficiency of any attachment almost inevitable, the need for a quality of sustained presence and consistent validation that the formation had taught her to need, and that the specific people and situations her adult life produced were rarely positioned to provide at the level the need required. Susan had taught Sarah to need that quality by failing to provide it at the moment in Sarah's formation when the provision was most critical. The teaching was not deliberate. It was the inadvertent instruction of a person whose choices had produced in the person bearing their consequences the specific educational content that the consequences contained. The public performance of fineness is the fourth consequence the record documents, and it is the one that connects most directly to Susan's own character rather than to the consequences of Susan's departure. Susan was a woman of considerable social intelligence who had always performed competence and warmth in social settings, with the naturalness of someone for whom the performance was integrated rather than separable from the genuine self. Sarah absorbed this quality in the fragment form that the 13 years of formation before the departure had produced, and the absorbed fragment expressed itself across Sarah's adult public life in the specific form of a woman who was often genuinely warm and genuinely good company in social settings, and who maintained that warmth and that company in conditions that the private reality of her life made the maintenance of considerably more demanding than the social performance allowed visible. The maintenance was real. The cost of the maintenance was real. The gap between the maintained surface and the private reality it covered was the gap that the formation had taught Sarah to maintain, because the formation had occurred in a household where the maintenance of the required surface across the gap between the private reality and the social requirement was one of the primary operational demands of daily life. What Susan did to Sarah, stated plainly, is this. She provided 13 years of a formation whose specific qualities, the social intelligence, the accurate assessment of situations and people, the capacity for genuine warmth, were genuinely valuable and genuinely absorbed. She removed herself from the formation at the moment when the developmental work of the adolescent years required her continued presence, and the removal was not followed by any arrangement that restored the presence in a form sufficient to continue the developmental work the removal had interrupted. She maintained the relationship with Sarah across the subsequent 24 years through the warmth and the contact and the genuine feeling that both parties brought to the maintenance, and the maintenance was real, and the feeling was real, and the warmth was real, and none of it was the sustained daily presence that the 13 years of Sarah's formation had been building toward, and that the departure had permanently removed. The consequences of the removal were the consequences that the subsequent decades of Sarah's public life documented. The hunger, the recklessness, the pattern, the performance, the specific combination of intelligence and anxiety, and the particular quality of someone who absorbed enough of their mother's capabilities to understand what was required, and not quite enough of the formation's completion to consistently produce it. Susan went to Argentina and built the life she had decided to build. She built it with the intelligence and the competence that had always been her most reliable assets, and she built it successfully in the specific terms she had defined for its success. The life she built was, by every available measure of the relevant criteria, the life she had assessed was worth the cost of the assessment's execution. The cost was paid by Sarah. The paying is the record that this account has assembled. The record is the account of what Susan Barrantes did to Sarah Ferguson, stated plainly, in the specific terms that the plain statement requires, and that the standard accounts of Sarah's life have consistently declined to produce. The palace found Susan vicious. The court found her alarming. The people who knew her found her ruthless. They were not wrong about what they found. They were simply describing the qualities of someone who had always been organized primarily around her own clearly understood priorities, and who had been very effective at pursuing those priorities across a lifetime of choices, whose consequences were paid by the people who bore them, rather than by the person who made them. Sarah bore the consequences. The bearing shaped her life. The shaping is this account's subject, and the account is complete. The departure of 1974 produced two daughters who were left behind, and the standard accounts of Susan Barrantes tend to treat them as a single consequence rather than as two separate people whose different ages at the departure and different personalities produced different responses to the same event and different formations from the same absence. The conflation is convenient for accounts organized around Susan as a biographical fact rather than as a subject. But the conflation obscures something important about what the departure actually did, and how it did it, because the difference between what it did to Jane and what it did to Sarah is itself the most precise available evidence about the specific mechanism through which maternal abandonment at different developmental stages produces different consequences in different people. Jane Ferguson was 16 years old in August 1974. 16 is not a straightforward age for the loss of a primary parent, but it is an age at which the primary developmental work of the adolescent formation is sufficiently advanced to have provided the person who is 16 with a specific set of capabilities that 13 has not yet produced. Jane had 3 additional years of formation that Sarah had not had. 3 years of adolescent development, in the specific circumstances of the Ferguson household, had given Jane a progressively more accurate understanding of what the household was and what the adults in it were doing. An understanding that the older child in a deteriorating marriage develops through the specific combination of observation and gradual comprehension that proximity to adult reality produces in children old enough to begin understanding what they are observing. Jane understood the Ferguson marriage with more accuracy than Sarah did in 1974. She understood it not in the adult sense of full comprehension of all its specific failures and their implications, but in the adolescent sense of someone who had observed enough of the texture of the daily life to have a context for the departure that the 13-year-old did not possess. The context was not comfort. The loss of a mother at 16 is not comfortable simply because the 16-year-old has a context for the departure that the 13-year-old lacks. But the context is a framework, and a framework is something that the processing of the loss can organize itself around, which is the specific difference between losing your mother at 16 and losing her at 13. Sarah had no adequate framework. She had the fact of the departure and the distance it created and the warmth of the maintained contact across the distance. And she had the specific cognitive understanding that the departure had been the consequence of the marriage's failure, rather than the consequence of anything she had done. The cognitive understanding was available to her at 13 in the sense of being expressible as a proposition she could state and assent to. It was not available to her at the level of formation where the understanding that actually organizes the adult character operates, because the formation operates below the level of cognitive proposition, and because the formation at 13 had not yet developed the depth that would have been required for the cognitive understanding to reach it. What reached the formation was the simpler and more permanent fact of the departure itself. The departure happened, the mother was there, and then was not there. The not being there was the formative reality, and the cognitive explanation for the not being there was a layer applied on top of the formative reality, rather than something that replaced the formative reality or modified its consequences. Jane managed the departure with the specific resilience of the older sibling in a situation where the younger sibling was less equipped. The accounts of the Ferguson household in the years following 1974 describe Jane in terms that reflect the specific qualities of someone who had absorbed enough of Susan's practical intelligence to apply it to the management of a difficult domestic situation. She was capable, she was present for Sarah in the ways her own adolescent development allowed, and she managed the transition from the pre-departure household to the post-departure one with the specific competence that the circumstances required and that her formation had produced in her. The subsequent adult trajectories of the two sisters are themselves the evidence of the formation differential. Jane's adult life was the adult life of someone who had received a more complete maternal formation than Sarah had received, more private, less dramatically visible in the public record, organized around a stable domestic life and a specific distance from the institutional world that Sarah had entered and found consistently difficult to manage within. Jane did not marry into the royal family. Jane did not generate the specific pattern of public visibility and private chaos that the royal marriage and its aftermath produced in Sarah. Jane did not carry into her adult relationships the specific hunger and the specific recklessness that the formation gap had produced in Sarah. Jane was not without her own formation's consequences. The Ferguson household had produced in both daughters the specific qualities that a household managed around the performance of an inadequate surface had produced in the people formed within it. Jane had absorbed those qualities and the specific consequences of the 1974 departure alongside them. The absorption had produced a person whose adult life reflected a more complete version of the maternal formation than Sarah had received, which is not the same as producing a person without formative damage, but which is the specific difference between a formation interrupted at 16 and a formation interrupted at 13. Sarah's formation interrupted at 13 produced the specific pattern that this account has documented across parts 1 through 10, the hunger, the recklessness, the pattern of attachment and insufficiency, the performance of fineness over the private reality of its cost. These were the specific consequences of the formation's interruption at the specific developmental moment, when the interruption had most acute consequences. The comparison is not a competition between the two daughters, or an assessment of their relative worth or capability. It is the specific evidence that the departure's consequences were the specific consequences of a departure that happened at 13 rather than at 16, and that the difference of 3 years in the developmental position of the person bearing the consequences produced differences in the consequences themselves that the honest account of what Susan did to Sarah requires to document. Sarah was not simply damaged by the departure in the generic sense that all departures of primary parents damage the children who bear them. She was damaged in the specific sense that the departure at 13 produced in her the specific formation whose consequences the subsequent decades of her public life documented with a consistency that the honest account of the departure and its timing makes entirely legible. Susan departed at the worst possible moment for Sarah's specific developmental position. The worst possible moment was not chosen because it was the worst possible moment for Sarah. It was chosen because it was the right moment for Susan, whose assessment of when the departure was warranted was organized around her own priorities, rather than around the developmental requirements of the daughter who was 13, and who needed the formation to continue for the years that the departure ended it. The right moment for Susan was the wrong moment for Sarah. Both things were true simultaneously. The honest account requires holding both truths together rather than using either to cancel the other. The departure was right for Susan in the sense that the assessment it expressed was accurate and the life it produced was the life the assessment had concluded was worth the cost of the execution. The departure was wrong for Sarah in the sense that it removed the primary developmental resource at the moment when that resource was most critically required and could least be substituted for by the alternative arrangements that the departure's management provided. Both daughters bore the consequences of the departure's timing. Jane bore them from the position of someone who had 3 more years of formation behind her. Sarah bore them from the position of someone for whom those 3 years had not yet happened, and would not happen with the person whose presence was supposed to produce them. The difference was 3 years. The difference was everything. Ronald Ferguson's response to Susan's departure in 1974 was the response that his character and his formation equipped him to produce, which was a response organized around the maintenance of the required surface, rather than around the honest engagement with what the departure had done to the household and to the daughters who remained in it. The response was not malicious. Ronald was not a man of malicious intent toward the people he had failed, and the people who knew him across the relevant period are consistent in describing someone whose genuine warmth was real alongside the specific limitations that made the warmth consistently insufficient for the demands it was required to meet. He maintained Dummerdown Farm. He kept the daughters in the Hampshire world that the marriage had established them in, at the schools and the social occasions and the specific circuits that the relevant world organized around the relevant social credentials. He was present at the required occasions with the warmth that his character reliably produced in social settings, and the presence and the warmth gave the post-departure household a surface that the relevant world could receive as the surface of a functional family, rather than as the surface of a household managing the specific aftermath of a mother's departure. The management of the surface was Ronald's primary competence, and it was the competence he deployed most reliably in the years following 1974. He did not sit Jane and Sarah down and have the specific, honest conversation about what had happened and what it meant and what the household was going to be now, and how the specific developmental requirements of the daughter's formation were going to be met in Susan's absence. The conversation was not available to Ronald because Ronald was not a man of direct, honest engagement with the difficult dimensions of situations he was managing. He was a man of surfaces, and the surface he managed across the years following the departure was the surface of a household that was fine, that was managing, that had the required warmth and the required social positioning and the required paternal presence. The surface was not the reality. The reality was 2 daughters whose primary maternal figure had departed, and whose formation was proceeding in the absence of the specific developmental resources that the maternal figure had been providing. The reality was a 13-year-old Sarah whose formation gap was accumulating across the adolescent years without the specific provision that might have addressed the gap if the honest assessment of what the gap required had been the organizing principle of the household's management. Ronald's limitations as the sole remaining parent were the limitations of his formation and his character, and they are worth examining specifically rather than simply noting generically, because the specific form of his limitations was the specific form that produced, in combination with Susan's departure, the particular pattern of Sarah's adult formation, rather than some other pattern. The limitation was not the limitation of genuine emotional unavailability, in the sense that Ronald had no genuine warmth for his daughters. He had genuine warmth. He was genuinely fond of both Jane and Sarah, and the fondness expressed itself in the specific ways his character allowed: the physical presence at the required occasions, the warmth of the social interaction, the particular quality of a father who was good company in the social sense, and who communicated to his daughters through the quality of his company that he valued them and enjoyed their presence. The limitation was the limitation of someone whose expression of genuine warmth was organized around the social register of the relevant world, rather than around the specific developmental requirements of adolescent daughters navigating a significant loss. Ronald could be warm in the polo world's social register. He could not be present in the specific sense of sitting with a 13-year-old daughter's grief about her mother's departure, and engaging with the grief honestly and providing the specific kind of sustained, non-performative emotional availability that the engagement with grief of that kind requires. The polo world's social register was not equipped for that engagement. Ronald was not equipped for it beyond the polo world's social register. The household in the years following 1974 was therefore a household managed primarily within the polo world's social register, which provided the required warmth and the required surface, and consistently failed to provide the specific developmental resource that the formation of two daughters who had lost their primary maternal figure at 13 and 16 required. Sarah absorbed the failure alongside the warmth. The absorption was the absorption of her formation, beneath the level of cognitive proposition, at the level where the actual character is being built from the raw material that the formation environment provides. The warmth was absorbed. The failure was also absorbed. Both became part of the substrate from which the adult Sarah was built. The specific contribution of Ronald's limitations to the adult Sarah's formation was the contribution of demonstrating across the years of the post-departure household that the primary available male figure in her formation shared certain qualities with the primary absent female figure. The organization around the social surface, the warmth that was genuine within the social register and insufficient outside it, the specific pattern of providing what the social register required and not providing what the honest engagement with the formation's actual requirements demanded. The pattern was familiar. It was the pattern that the formation's most significant figures had both demonstrated in their different ways. Susan had provided genuine warmth within the limits of the distance she had chosen and the intermittency that the distance produced. Ronald provided genuine warmth within the limits of the social register he was equipped to operate in, and the sustained developmental engagement that the social register did not require. Both the warmth and the limits were the material from which Sarah's adult relationships were built. She sought the warmth. She consistently encountered the limits. The encountering of the limits was experienced as the failure of the relationship to provide what she needed, rather than as the predictable consequence of seeking the specific warmth that the formation had taught her to seek from the specific people whose warmth came with the specific limits that the formation had also taught her to expect. Ronald understood that the daughters needed their mother. He did not understand or did not act on his understanding of the specific developmental requirements that Susan's absence had left unmet in the formation environment he was managing. The understanding that was available to him was the understanding organized around the social register. The daughters needed their mother in the sense that children need their mothers, and the management of that need through the maintenance of the household's required surface, and the specific contact arrangements that the departure had left available, was the management of someone doing what his competence allowed him to do, rather than what the situation honestly required. The management was insufficient in the specific ways that this account has documented in its examination of Sarah's adult formation. It was also genuine within its own limits, and the genuineness within its limits is the quality that the honest account of Ronald's role requires acknowledging alongside the honest account of its insufficiency. Ronald was not a villain in Sarah's formation. He was a man whose genuine warmth was organized around the social register of a world that had no mechanism for providing what Sarah's formation actually required in the absence of Susan's sustained presence, and who managed the formation environment with the tools his character and his world provided, rather than with the tools the situation honestly demanded. The tools were insufficient. The insufficiency was consequential. The consequences were the consequences that the adult Sarah expressed across the decades of her public life. Susan's departure and Ronald's management of its aftermath were the two primary formative conditions of the adult Sarah's specific character. Neither party intended the consequences their choices and their limitations produced. Both parties produced them anyway. The consequences were real regardless of the intention, and the honest account of those consequences is the honest account of what Sarah Ferguson's adult formation was built from, and why the building took the specific form it took. The qualities Sarah inherited from Susan Barrantes are not difficult to identify in the public record of Sarah's adult life, because the inheritance was visible in the specific ways that genetic and formative inheritances from primary parents are visible. not as a copy of the original but as a variant, shaped by the different circumstances and the different formation that the inheriting person brought to the raw material the inheritance provided. Susan was socially intelligent. The intelligence was the specific intelligence of someone who read rooms accurately, assessed people and situations with the clarity of genuine perception rather than the managed perception, that's the effectiveness of the deployment, with a reliability that the available record documents across multiple contexts and multiple decades. Sarah had a version of this intelligence. The version she had was the version that 13 years of primary formation in Susan's company, followed by 24 years of periodic contact across a chosen distance, had produced, genuine in its perceptive quality, inconsistent in its deployment, often accurate in its assessment, and frequently ineffective in its translation of the accurate assessment into the specific action the assessment required. The inconsistency was the most significant difference between Susan's version of the intelligence and Sarah's version of it, and the inconsistency was the consequence of the formation's interruption at 13. Susan's intelligence had been developed to its full operational form across the full span of the relevant formation, the childhood and the adolescence and the young adult years, and the specific practice across the Ferguson marriage and the Argentine life that the full formation and the full deployment had produced. Sarah's version had been developed to the point it had reached at 13, and had continued to develop in the post-departure household, without the specific resource of Susan's daily presence and example that the full development would have required. The result was someone who was often genuinely perceptive about situations and people, and whose perceptive assessments were frequently accurate, but whose translation of those assessments into effective action was frequently compromised by the specific emotional interference that the formation's incompleteness had left as a consistent background condition of her decision-making. The emotional interference was the interference of the hunger and the anxiety and the specific pattern of needs that the formation gap had produced, operating on the accurate perceptions in ways that consistently modified the translation of perception into action in the direction of the emotional need rather than in the direction that the accurate perception by itself would have produced. Susan assessed situations and people accurately and acted on the accurate assessment in service of her own clearly understood priorities, and the clearly understood priorities were clear partly because the formation had been complete enough to produce in her the specific self-knowledge that allows priorities to be clearly understood rather than obscured by the emotional interference that incomplete formation tends to produce. Sarah assessed situations and people with comparable accuracy in many instances, and then acted on the assessment in ways that the emotional interference modified in the direction of the needs the formation gap had produced. The modification was the specific mechanism through which the genuine intelligence produced outcomes that were frequently less effective than the intelligence by itself would have produced if the emotional interference had not been the consistent background condition of its operation. This is the inheritance in its most specific form, not the intelligence without the conditions of its operation, but the intelligence with the specific conditions that the formation had attached to it, conditions that in Susan's case were the conditions of a complete formation and clearly understood priorities, and in Sarah's case were the conditions of an incomplete formation and the specific emotional interference that the incompleteness had left as the permanent background of the intelligence's operation. The physical quality was another element of the inheritance. Susan was strikingly attractive across the full span of her visible adult life, and Sarah inherited a version of the physical quality that the photographs of her in the relevant period document, attractive in the specific way that combined genuine warmth with genuine physical presence, visible in rooms in the way that Susan had been visible, possessed of the particular quality of physical ease that Susan had always had, and that the formation in Susan's company had transmitted to the daughter who was most directly formed by it. The physical inheritance was the simpler and more complete of the two primary inheritances, because physical qualities are transmitted through biological mechanisms that are not dependent on the completeness of the formative period for their transmission. Sarah looked like Susan in the specific ways that daughters look like their mothers, when the genetic transmission has been strong, and the looking like was not simply a visual fact, but the transmission of the specific physical quality whose social value Susan had always understood and deployed with such consistent effectiveness. Sarah's understanding of her own physical quality was less consistently effective than Susan's understanding of the comparable quality had been. The understanding was present. Sarah knew she had a physical presence that other people responded to, and she used the knowing in the specific ways that the social world she inhabited made available for such use. The using was less disciplined and less strategically organized than Susan's use of the comparable quality had been, for the same reason that the intelligence's deployment was less disciplined. The specific emotional interference that the incomplete formation had left as the background condition of the deployment, modifying the strategic deployment in the direction of the immediate emotional need rather than in the direction of the clearly understood longer-term priority. The warmth was the third and most visible element of the inheritance, and it was the element that the public reception of Sarah across the years of the royal marriage and beyond most consistently identified as her most significant quality. The warmth was genuine. It had the specific quality of genuineness that Susan's warmth had always had, organized around the actual person being warm rather than around the performance of warmth, expressive of something real rather than something managed. The inheritance of the warmth was the most complete of the three primary inheritances, perhaps because warmth is the quality whose transmission through the primary formation is most direct and least dependent on the completion of the formation for the quality's full transmission. The 13 years of formation in Susan's company were 13 years of consistent exposure to a specific quality of warmth that was genuine and that was expressed consistently in the formation environment, and the exposure produced in Sarah a warmth whose genuineness reflected the genuineness of the quality that the formation had transmitted. The warmth was what the public found most appealing about Sarah. It was what had generated the public's initial enthusiasm for her at the time of the royal engagement. It was what sustained the public's affection for her across the years of the royal marriage's difficulties, when the other qualities that the formation had produced in her were generating the specific public account of a woman whose conduct was consistently more chaotic than the institution she had married into found manageable. The warmth was real. The chaos was also real. Both were inheritances from the formation that Susan's presence and Susan's departure had produced. The warmth came from the 13 years. The chaos came from the gap that the departure had created in the formation, and that the subsequent decades of maintained contact across a chosen distance had never filled. Susan gave Sarah the warmth and created the gap, and the gap produced the chaos, and the combination of the warmth and the chaos was the combination that the public found simultaneously appealing and alarming across the full span of Sarah's public life. The inheritance was the gift and the damage simultaneously. Susan was the source of both. The source went to Argentina in 1974 and built her life there, and the warmth and the damage both developed in Sarah's formation in the specific ways that the source's presence and the source's absence together produced, and the public record of Sarah Ferguson's adult life is the record of what those specific things produced in the specific person who inherited them. The record is what the record is. The source made the record. The institutional management of Susan Barrantes across the decade of Sarah's royal marriage was the management of a problem that the relevant people in the palace found consistently outside the range of the tools they had available for managing the problems they normally encountered. This is worth stating precisely rather than gesturing at generally, because the precision reveals something important about both Susan and the palace that the general statement obscures. The palace was not inexperienced at managing difficult peripheral figures in the royal world. The 20th century had provided multiple occasions for the development of exactly this capability, and the institutional memory of how such figures had been managed across the relevant decades was available to the people whose professional function required them to apply it in the specific case of Susan Barrantes. The Duke of Windsor's post-abdication social world had required management. The various commercial and personal difficulties generated by extended family members across the relevant decades had required management. The specific challenges of managing the social worlds of senior royals whose marriages were producing private chaos had required management, and the palace had developed, through the experience of managing all of these situations, a reasonably sophisticated toolkit for the relevant category of challenge. The toolkit's primary instruments were access management, social signal management, and the specific management of the institutional atmosphere through which the relevant world communicated to its peripheral members what the appropriate conduct was and what the consequences of inappropriate conduct would be. Access management meant controlling the occasions and the contexts at which peripheral figures were present in the royal world, reducing access as a consequence of conduct the institution found problematic, and restoring it as a reward for conduct the institution found acceptable. Social signal management meant deploying the specific social signals through which the palace world communicated its assessments, the warming or cooling of specific relationships, the inclusion or exclusion from specific occasions, the particular quality of the institutional atmosphere around specific people that communicated to the relevant social world how those people were currently regarded. These were effective instruments against people whose institutional access was valuable enough to them to make its threatened withdrawal a genuine constraint on their conduct. The threat of reduced access only works as a management tool when the person being threatened values the access sufficiently to modify their conduct to avoid the reduction. The social signal management only works as a management tool when the person being signaled is sufficiently embedded in the relevant social world to find the signal's content consequential for their social positioning. Susan valued the access. She valued it in the specific way that someone values something useful without requiring it, as an asset she was managing rather than as a necessity she was dependent on. The palace's ability to threaten the reduction of something valued but not required was the ability to apply pressure that Susan could absorb without the modification of conduct that the pressure was designed to produce, because the modification would have cost more in terms of the priorities that organized Susan's conduct than the pressure was threatening to cost in terms of the access it was threatening to reduce. The social signal management encountered a comparable limitation. Susan was embedded in the palace social world through Sarah's marriage, but her primary social world was the international polo circuit, and the Argentine social world the estancia had given her access to, and her positioning within those primary social worlds was not dependent on the palace's social signals, in the way that the positioning of people whose primary social world was the palace social world was dependent on those signals. The palace could cool its social atmosphere around Susan without producing the consequences in her primary social world that the cooling would have produced in someone whose primary social world was the palace world itself. The limitation of the standard toolkit was therefore the fundamental structural limitation that Susan's specific relationship to the palace world imposed on every instrument in the toolkit. The instruments were designed for people who needed the access and the social positioning that the palace world provided. Susan wanted the access and found the social positioning useful, but did not need either in the sense that made the threatened withdrawal an effective constraint on conduct. The palace officials who dealt most directly with the management challenge Susan presented across the relevant decade were officials whose professional assessments of the challenge were produced within this structural limitation and whose private language about Susan reflected the specific frustration of professionals whose tools were consistently insufficient for the problem they were being applied to. Mark Boland, who served as Deputy Private Secretary to Charles across the latter part of the relevant period, was among the officials whose professional world brought him into the management of the press dimensions of the broader royal family difficulties of the early 1990s, and whose assessments of Susan's contribution to those difficulties were among the more direct available in the accounts of the period. His characterizations of Susan in the private contexts where his professional assessments were expressed were characterizations that the people who worked alongside him have described in terms that the word vicious most accurately reflects, not vicious in the sense of personally hostile, but vicious in the specific institutional sense of the precise, knowing transgression that the word's original meaning carries. Geoffrey Crawford, who managed the press dimensions of the palace's operation across the period when Susan's conduct was most consistently damaging to the institutional management of Sarah's royal life, maintained in his professional assessments a description of Susan that was as consistent as the behavior it was describing. Crawford was a professional whose entire career had been organized around the management of difficult press situations in the specific context of the royal world, and his description of Susan as the most consistently difficult peripheral figure he had managed across the relevant period was the description of a professional making a professional assessment rather than a personal one. The distinction between the professional assessment and the personal one is important for the honest account of the palace's response to Susan, because the standard narrative about the palace's dislike of Susan tends to organize itself around the personal dimensions of the relevant officials' responses, the specific quality of the individual's character that made them unable to manage someone of Susan's specific combination of qualities, rather than around the professional dimensions that the accurate account requires to be foregrounded. The palace found Susan difficult not because the relevant officials were inadequate to the management of difficult people, but because the structural limitation that Susan's specific position imposed on the available management tools made even the most competent management consistently insufficient for the specific challenge she presented. The frustration was the frustration of professional competence encountering a structural constraint that the professional competence could not overcome, and the private language that the frustration produced was the language of that specific experience, rather than the language of personal dislike. The decade of managed conflict produced specific episodes that documented the management challenge in its most acute form. The 1992 separation of Charles and Diana intensified the press appetite for material about both royal marriages, and the intensified appetite produced the intensified pressure on every available source of access to the relevant private dimensions of those marriages. Susan's conduct in the specific conditions of the intensified press appetite was the conduct of someone who understood that the intensified appetite had increased the value of the access she was in a position to deploy, and who deployed that increased value with the same assessment-based competence that she brought to every deployment of a valued asset. The specific consequence of the deployment in the conditions of 1992 and 1993 was the specific contribution to the accumulation of coverage about Sarah's marriage that the palace found most alarming in those years. The coverage was not solely Susan's contribution. Diana's own management of her public account, through the specific channel she was deploying across the same period, was a far larger contribution to the press account of the royal marriage's difficulties than Susan's deployment of her more limited access could produce. But Susan's contribution was the contribution from the specific angle of Sarah's family background, and the family background angle was an angle the palace found particularly difficult to manage because it came from someone who was not subject to the institutional management tools that the palace could apply to the people within its institutional perimeter. The decade of managed conflict ended with the Ferguson divorce in 1996. The divorce reduced the institutional significance of Susan's position in the royal world, from the position of the Duchess of York's mother to the position of the former Duchess of York's mother, and the reduction of the institutional significance produced a corresponding reduction in the commercial value of the press access Susan's position had provided. The press appetite for Susan's specific form of access diminished as the specific circumstances that had produced the appetite changed, and the reduction of the appetite reduced the deployment's value, and therefore the deployment's management of those interests in service of anyone else's, a management that her character and her structural position made consistently unavailable. They were not wrong. She was exactly what the available record shows her to have been. A specific person whose specific qualities operated with the specific consistency that this account has documented across 15 sections of the examination they required. The daughter she shaped was Sarah Ferguson. The shaping is what this account has examined. The examination is complete. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.